Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, was first published in 1751. Gray had begun writing the poem in 1742, shortly after the death of his close friend Richard West. An elegy is a poem which laments the dead. Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard is noteworthy because it mourns the death not of great or famous people but of common men. The speaker of this poem sees a country churchyard at sunset, which impels him to meditate on the nature of human mortality. The poem invokes the classical idea of memento mori, a Latin phrase which states plainly to all mankind, remember that you must die. The speaker considers the fact that in death there is no difference between great and common people. He goes on to wonder if among the lowly people buried in the churchyard there had been any natural poets or politicians whose talent had simply never been discovered or nurtured. This thought leads him to praise the dead for the honest, simple lives that they lived. The poem was written at the end of the Augustan age and at the beginning of the Romantic period. The poem has characteristics associated with both literary periods. On the one hand, it has the ordered, balanced phrasing and rational sentiments of neoclassical poetry. On the other hand, it tends toward the emotionalism and individualism of the Romantic poets. Most importantly, it idealizes and elevates the man. Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard is written in heroic quatrains. A quatrain is a 4-line stanza. Heroic quatrains rhyme in AB pattern and are written in iambic pentameter. An iamb is a poetic foot consisting of one unstressed and one stressed syllable. Let's see the summary of the poem. In the first stanza, the speaker observes the signs of a country day drawing to a close, a curfew bell ringing, a herd of cattle moving ex the pasture, and a farm laborer returning home. The speaker is then left alone to contemplate the isolated rural scene. The first line of the poem sets a distinctly sober tone. The curfew bell does not simply ring, it knells, a term usually to bells rung at a death or funeral. From the start, Gray reminds us of human mortality. The second stanza sustains the sober tone of the first. The speaker is not mournful but pensive as he describes the peaceful landscape that surrounds him. Even the air is characterized as having a solemn stillness. The sound of an owl hooting intrudes upon the evening quiet. We are told that the owl complains in this context. The word does not mean to whine or grumble, but to express. The owl's call then is suggestive of grief. Note that at no point in these 3 opening stanzas Gray directly referred to death or a funeral. Rather, he indirectly creates a funeral atmosphere by describing just a few mournful sounds. It is in the 4th stanza that the speaker directly draws our attention to the graves in the country churchyard. We are presented with 2 potentially conflicting images of death. Line 14 describes the heaps of earth surrounding the graves. In order to dig a grave, the earth must necessarily be disrupted. Note that the syntax of this line is slightly confusing. We would expect this sentence to read, where the turf heaves, not where heaves the turf. Gray has inverted the word order. Just as the earth has been disrupted, the syntax imitates the way in which the earth has been disrupted. But by the same token, the rude forefathers buried beneath the earth seem entirely at peace. We are told that they are laid in cells, a term which reminds us of the quiet of a monastery, and that they sleep. If the forefathers are sleeping, the speaker reminds us that they will never again rise from the beds to hear the pleasurable sounds of country life that the living do. The term lowly beds describes not only the unpretentious graves in which the forefathers are buried, but the humble conditions that they endured when they were alive. The speaker then moves on to consider some of the other pleasures the dead will no longer enjoy: the happiness of home, wife, and children. The dead will also no longer be able to enjoy the pleasures of work or plowing the fields each day. This stanza points to the way in which the poem contains elements of both Augustan and Romantic poetry. Poetry that describes agriculture, as this one does, is Georgic. Georgic verse was extremely popular in the 18th century. Gray closely identifies the farmers with land that they work. This association of man and nature is suggestive of a romantic attitude. The Georgic elements of the stanza almost demand that we characterize as typical of the 18th century, but its tone looks forward to the Romantic period. The next four stanzas caution those who are wealthy and powerful not to look down on the poor. These lines warn the reader not to slight the obscure destiny of the poor. The fact that they will never be famous or have long histories or annals written about them. The next stanza invokes the idea of memento mori, literally a reminder of mortality. The speaker reminds the reader that regardless of social position, beauty, or wealth, the speaker also challenges the reader not to look down on the poor for having modest, simple graves. He suggests that the elaborate memorials that adorn the graves of the proud are somehow excessive. In this context, the word fretted in line 39 has a double meaning. On the one hand, it can refer to the design on a cathedral ceiling. On the other, it can suggest that there is something fretful or troublesome about the extravagant memorials of the wealthy. The speaker observes that nothing can bring the dead back to life, and that all the advantages that the wealthy had in life are useless in the face of death. Neither elaborate funeral monuments nor impressive honors can restore life, nor can flattery in some way be used to change the mind of death. Note here Gray's use of persona in characterizing both flattery and death, as though death has a will or mind of its own. The speaker then reconsiders the poor people buried in the churchyard. He wonders what great deeds they might have accomplished had they been given the opportunity. One of these poor farmers, reasons, might have been a great emperor. Another might have waked the living lyre, or been a great poet or musician. The poor are never able to fulfill their political and artistic potential. However, because they were uneducated, they never received the knowledge. They never received the knowledge that would enable them to rule and to create. Instead, penury or poverty froze the genial current of their soul. That is, poverty paralyzed their ability to draw upon their innermost passions, the very passions that have inspired them to become great poets or politicians. In a series of analogies, Gray observes that the talents of the poor are like a gem hidden in the ocean or a flower blooming in the desert. Just as an unseen flower in the desert is a waste, Gray suggests of the poor are also a waste because they remain unused and undeveloped. The speaker then compares these poor uneducated people to three of the most famous and powerful people of the previous century. John Hampden, a parliamentary leader who defended the people against the abuses of Charles I, John Milton, the great poet who wrote Paradise Lost and who also opposed Charles I, and Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England from 1653 to 1658. The speaker suggests that buried in this churchyard might be someone who had the innate ability to oppose tyranny but never had the opportunity to exercise that ability. This person, the speaker, reasons, with the proper education and resources might have commanded the government as well as any great political leader. Gray gives us two ways in which to consider this power. On the one hand, a great ruler can receive applause and can ignore threats of pain and ruin. A great leader can scatter plenty, can offer prosperity to a grateful nation. But on the other hand, if one governs, one is in fact exposed to dangerous threats, and simply governing to receive applause suggests a shallow and self-serving motive. Scattering plenty implies that the wealth of a nation can be squandered by its rulers. Gray may be suggesting that having power is not as desirable as it seems. Note that the final line of this stanza is enjabbed. It continues into the following line, and in this case, the next stanza. The first line of the next stanza continues the thought of the previous, enjambed line. It abruptly reminds us that the impoverished conditions of the poor forbade them from becoming great rulers. Gray underscores the abrupt shock of this idea by abruptly interrupting the flow of the line with a caesura. Building on the idea of the previous stanza, the speaker notes that if poverty prevented the free laborers from acquiring the virtues of great and powerful people, it also prevented them from committing the crimes often associated with those people, and especially with those people who hold political power. In particular, it prevented them from engaging in the bloody activity associated with the civil war. Because these farm laborers were not in positions of power, the speaker reasons they never had to ignore their own consciences, nor did they sacrifice their artistic talents to luxury or pride. The speaker continues his praise of the simple life of common people. They are far from the madding crowd of city and political life. Madding here can mean either maddening, that is the source of madness or insanity, or it can mean mad, that is the crowd is itself hatefully insane. In either case, the common country people were removed from this insane world. As a result, they never strayed into the immoral acts of the powerful. Instead, they kept steadily to their simple but meaningful lives. The speaker then reminds us that these common people, in fact, long dead. He notes that even if they were not powerful or great, and even if they do not have an elaborate memorial of the sort mentioned in line 38, they still deserve homage or tribute. At the very least, he suggests an onlooker. Here, the multiple meanings we can attach to the word passing. It can refer to the onlooker who is simply walking or passing by these graves. It can mean in passing that someone seeing these graves should take just a moment out of their busy lives to remember the dead. And passing itself is a euphemism for death. In a way, then, Gray is suggesting that there is no difference between the person passing by the grave and the person who has passed away. Another reminder that all will eventually die. Instead of fame and elegy, the people buried here have modest tombstones, which display only their names and the dates of their birth and death. These common people were not famous, and no one has written elaborate elegies or funeral verses for them. Still, the very modesty of their tombstones testify to the nobility and holy nature of their simple lives. As such, they provide an example not so much of how life should be lived, but how its end, death, should be approached. The term rustic moralist here is open to interpretation. It may refer to anyone who is in the country, but more likely it refers to the speaker who is himself moralizing, preaching, or contemplating about the nature of both life and death. The speaker reasons that most people, faced with the prospect of dying and ultimately being forgotten, cling to life. Note in 86, this pleasing anxious being. On the one hand, being a living can be anxious, filled with worries. On the other hand, just being alive when faced with death is itself pleasing or pleasant. The speaker is suggesting that even the troubles and worries of life are enjoyable in comparison to death. The dead rely on the living to remember them and to mourn for them. The speaker suggests that this need is so fundamental that even from the grave the buried dead seem to ask for remembrance. In fact, as line 92 suggests, the dead actually live on in our memories. In the next stanza, the speaker addresses himself. He reasons that since he himself has been mindful of the dead and has remembered and prized them, in this poem perhaps when he is dead, someone will remember him. This person, he reasons, will necessarily be a kindred spirit, someone who is also a lonely wanderer in the country, meditating on the nature of death. The speaker then goes on to imagine his own death. He envisions this kindred spirit seeing his grave and wondering about his life and death. In the next 5 stanzas, the speaker imagines how an old farm laborer might remember him after his death. If the speaker speculates, the kindred spirit sees the speaker's grave and wonders about it. Perhaps the old man would say that the speaker was often seen wandering about the countryside at dawn. Presumably, he was frequently out all night, as no doubt he has been in this very poem. At noon, the old man continues, the speaker would frequently stretch out under an old tree at noon and stare at a nearby brook. The old man would have observed that the speaker's moods were changeable. Sometimes the speaker would wander about in the nearby woods, smiling scornfully and talking to himself. Other times he would appear depressed. Then again sometimes he would look as though he were in anguish. Perhaps the old man speculates the speaker had been crossed in hopeless love. The speaker continues to imagine this old man, remembering him after his death. The old man would have noticed one morning that the speaker was absent. He was not in any of his number. The speaker did not appear the following day. The third day, however, the old man and his friends would have seen the speaker's body being carried to the churchyard for burial. The speaker then is imagining himself buried in the very graveyard he once used to wander by. The old man invites this curious spirit to read the speaker's epitaph. Note the reminder that the old man is uneducated. He cannot read, although the passerby can do so. The last 3 stanzas are in fact the speaker's epitaph. The way in which the reader imagines his epitaph will read. Through the epitaph, the speaker asks the passerby and the reader not to remember him as wealthy, famous, or brilliantly educated, but as one who was melancholic or deeply thoughtful and sad. The speaker asks that we remember him for being generous and sincere. His generosity was in fact his willingness to mourn for the dead. Because he was so generous, the speaker reasons, heaven gave him a friend, someone who would in turn mourn for him after his death. This friend is unnamed, but we can deduce that it is any kindred spirit, including the reader, who reads the speaker's epitaph and remembers him. The speaker concludes by cautioning the reader not to praise him any further. He also asks that his frailties, his flaws, or personal weaknesses not be considered. Rather, they should be left to the care of God, with whom the speaker now resides. The poem then is an elegy not only for the common man, but for the speaker himself. Indeed, by the end of the poem, it is evident that the speaker himself wishes to be identified not with the great and famous, but with the common people whom he was prized